The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of London as David stepped out of his hotel room, stretching his arms above his head. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with the confident posture of someone who had spent most of his life in martial arts training halls. His girlfriend Lisa was still getting ready in the bathroom, taking her time with makeup and hair. "Come on, babe. We don't have all day," David called out, checking his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. He was wearing his favorite black t-shirt that showed off his muscular arms, the ones he had built through years of dedicated training at his martial arts school back home in California. Lisa emerged from the bathroom, rolling her eyes playfully. "Relax, David. The palace isn't going anywhere." She was used to his impatience, especially when he was excited about something. Today was their only free day before his big tournament started, and David had insisted they visit all the famous London landmarks. David had been teaching martial arts for 6 years now, ever since he earned his 3rd-degree black belt. His students looked up to him, and honestly, he enjoyed the respect that came with his skills. Back home, people knew not to mess with him. He had won dozens of competitions and rarely lost a sparring match. The upcoming European tournament was supposed to be his biggest challenge yet, and he felt ready for anything. "You know what I'm most excited about?" David said as they walked down the hotel corridor. "Seeing those guards at Buckingham Palace, the ones who just stand there like statues." Lisa gave him a look she had perfected over their 2 years together. It was the look that said she could already tell where his mind was going. "Please tell me you're not planning to do anything stupid." "What do you mean?" David laughed, pressing the elevator button. "I just want to see if they really don't move at all. It's like a tourist thing, right? Everyone tries to make them laugh or react." The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. Lisa pressed the ground floor button and turned to face her boyfriend. "David, I'm serious. Promise me you won't do anything that might get us in trouble. We're in a foreign country." David wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Baby, relax. I'm just curious about their training. As a martial artist, you know? I respect discipline and control. These guys are supposed to be the best of the best." But even as he said it, David felt that familiar itch in the back of his mind. It was the same feeling he got before sparring matches, a mix of excitement and the need to prove himself. He had always been competitive, even as a kid. His parents used to joke that he couldn't walk past a "do not touch" sign without at least thinking about touching whatever it was. The hotel lobby was busy with tourists speaking different languages, all heading out to explore London. David and Lisa joined the crowd on the sidewalk where black cabs and red double-decker buses filled the streets. The energy of the city was infectious, and David felt his excitement growing. "First stop, Buckingham Palace," he announced, hailing a taxi. During the ride, Lisa tried to distract him by pointing out famous buildings and landmarks. But David's mind kept wandering back to the stories he had heard about the royal guards. People said they were trained never to react no matter what tourists did. Some claimed they were just for show, ceremonial figures who looked impressive but weren't real soldiers. David found that hard to believe. In his world, if you looked tough, you had to be tough. He had built his reputation by backing up his confident appearance with real skills. These guards, with their fancy uniforms and tall hats, seemed almost too perfect, too controlled. It made him wonder what would happen if someone really tested their limits. "You're thinking about those guards again, aren't you?" Lisa said, noticing his distant expression. "Just wondering about their training," David replied. "I mean, how do they learn to stand so still? It must take incredible mental discipline." The taxi pulled up to the palace gates, and David's eyes immediately went to the famous red-uniformed guards standing at attention. Even from a distance, they looked exactly like the pictures he had seen online. Perfectly straight posture, rifles held at precise angles, expressions completely blank. As they paid the taxi driver and joined the crowd of tourists, David felt his competitive instincts kicking in. Back home, he was known for pushing boundaries, for testing people's limits. It's what made him such an effective martial arts instructor. He could read people, find their weaknesses, and exploit them in training. "Look at all these tourists trying to get their attention," David observed, watching as people posed for photos next to the guards, made funny faces, and even waved their hands in front of the guards' eyes. The guards remained completely motionless, as if they were made of stone. Lisa was taking photos with her phone, genuinely excited to be at such a famous location. "This is so cool. Can you believe we're actually here?" But David was studying the guards like he would study an opponent before a match. He noticed how they held their rifles, how their eyes seemed to look straight ahead without focusing on anything specific, how they managed to breathe without their chests visibly moving. It's impressive, he admitted, but I bet it's mostly just an act. I mean, they're still human, right? A tour guide nearby was explaining to a group of Japanese tourists that the guards were real soldiers, not actors, and that they had serious military training. David listened with interest, his respect for them growing slightly. But at the same time, his curiosity was also growing. "David," Lisa said, grabbing his arm, "I know that look. Whatever you're thinking, don't." "I'm not thinking anything," he protested, but he was already walking closer to one of the guards. The man looked to be about David's age, maybe slightly younger, with pale skin and light brown hair visible under his tall black hat. His uniform was spotless, every button polished, every line perfectly straight. David had always been drawn to perfection like this, partly because he respected it, and partly because he wanted to test it. In martial arts, they taught that there was no such thing as a perfect defense. Every fighter, no matter how good, had weaknesses that could be found and exploited. "Sir, please step back behind the rope," a police officer nearby called out. David realized he had moved closer than the designated tourist area allowed. "Sorry," David said, stepping back with his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. But his eyes never left the guard, and his mind was already working, analyzing, planning. Lisa came up beside him and linked her arm through his. "Come on, let's go see the changing of the guard ceremony. I heard it's really something special." "Yeah, okay," David agreed. But he took one more long look at the motionless soldier. Something about the guard's complete stillness bothered him. It seemed almost unnatural, like a challenge waiting to be accepted. As they walked around the palace grounds with the other tourists, David found himself comparing the guards to the martial artists he knew back home. Even his most disciplined students would show some sign of awareness when someone approached them. A slight shift in breathing, a barely noticeable tension in their shoulders, something that showed they were human and alert. These guards showed nothing. It was as if they had turned themselves into living statues, and David couldn't help but wonder what it would take to break through that control. Not to hurt them, of course, just to see a crack in their perfect composure. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes, Lisa said, checking her phone. "Should we find a good spot to watch?" "Sure," David replied, but his attention was already drifting back to the guards stationed around the palace. Each one stood in exactly the same position, with exactly the same expression, like they had been programmed by the same software. As a martial artist, David prided himself on being able to read people, to understand their mental state through their body language. But these guards gave him nothing to work with. It was frustrating and fascinating at the same time. The crowd around them was growing larger as more tourists arrived for the ceremony. David noticed how people reacted to the guards, the mixture of respect and curiosity in their eyes. Some visitors seemed almost afraid to get too close, as if the guards might suddenly come to life like characters in a movie. But David felt no such hesitation. If anything, the guards' reputation only made him more interested in testing their limits. Back home, he was known for pushing his students past their comfort zones, for finding the breaking point that would help them grow stronger. Maybe, he thought, these guards could benefit from a little real-world testing too. After all, if they were truly as disciplined as everyone claimed, a small challenge shouldn't bother them at all. Lisa was pointing out architectural details of the palace, but David's focus remained on the soldiers. He found himself wondering about their training, their backgrounds, their personal lives. Were they really as unshakable as they appeared, or was it all just an elaborate performance for the tourists? The sun was getting higher in the sky, and David could see small beads of sweat forming on one guard's forehead. So they were human after all, he thought with satisfaction. The perfect composure was impressive, but it wasn't supernatural. "David, you're staring," Lisa whispered, following his gaze to the guard he had been watching. "Just admiring the discipline," he said. "It really is incredible." But even as he said it, David was already planning his next move. 20 minutes later, the changing of the guard ceremony was in full swing. David and Lisa had found a spot near the front of the crowd where they could see everything clearly. The precision of the marching soldiers was impressive, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. "This is amazing," Lisa whispered, recording everything on her phone. "Look how perfectly they move together." David nodded, but his attention kept drifting to the guards who remained at their posts during the ceremony. One guard in particular caught his eye. He was positioned about 30 feet away from the main ceremony, standing perfectly still while tourists walked past him, taking photos and making comments. The guard looked to be in his mid-20s, with a strong jaw and clear blue eyes that stared straight ahead. His name tag read Morrison, though David couldn't see his first name from this distance. What struck David most was how the guard seemed completely unaware of everything happening around him, even though hundreds of people were nearby. "I wonder what they're thinking about while they stand there," David said to Lisa. "Probably their training. Or maybe they're just focused on doing their job well," she replied, still filming the ceremony. But David wasn't satisfied with that answer. As someone who had spent years studying human behavior and body language, he found it hard to believe that anyone could be completely mentally absent while standing in such a public place. There had to be some level of awareness, some reaction to the environment around them. When the ceremony ended and the crowds began to disperse, David saw his opportunity. "Come on," he told Lisa, "let's get a closer look at that guard over there." "David, no," Lisa said, grabbing his arm. "The ceremony is over. Let's go see Westminster Abbey or something." "Just for a minute," David promised. "I want to see how close we can get." Against her better judgment, Lisa followed him as he walked toward the guard named Morrison. Other tourists were doing the same thing, taking selfies and posing next to the motionless soldier. David watched how the guard handled each interaction, looking for any sign of irritation or awareness. A family with young children approached first. The kids were excited and a little scared, whispering to each other about whether the guard was real or fake. Their father encouraged them to stand next to him for a photo, and the guard remained completely still throughout the entire process. Next came a group of college students who were clearly testing the guard's limits. They made funny faces inches from his eyes, waved their hands in front of his face, and even made silly noises. The guard's expression never changed, his breathing remained steady, and his grip on his rifle stayed exactly the same. David was impressed despite himself. The level of self-control was genuinely remarkable, but it also made him more curious about what it would take to get some kind of reaction. "See? He's like a robot," David said to Lisa as they moved closer. "That's the point," she replied. "It's called discipline. Something you could learn from." David laughed at her joke, but he was already planning his approach. As a martial arts instructor, he understood the importance of mental control and focus. He taught his students how to maintain composure under pressure, how to stay calm when opponents tried to intimidate them. But this was different. This was control taken to an extreme level that David had never seen before. It was almost unnatural, and it challenged everything he believed about human nature and limitations. "Excuse me," David said to the guard, stepping into his personal space. "Amazing day, isn't it?" The guard didn't respond, didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere in the distance, as if David didn't exist at all. "David, come on," Lisa urged, tugging at his sleeve. "Leave him alone." But David was just getting started. He had dealt with stubborn opponents before, people who thought they were tougher than they really were. The key was finding the right pressure point, the thing that would crack their composure. "I'm a martial artist myself," David continued, speaking directly to the guard. "Third-degree black belt. I really respect what you guys do here. The mental discipline must be incredible." Still no response. The guard's face remained as blank as a marble statue. Other tourists were starting to notice David's one-sided conversation, some filming with their phones, others looking uncomfortable. David felt his competitive instincts kicking in. Back home, when students tried to ignore his instructions or act tough, he had ways of getting their attention. Usually it involved demonstrating his superior skills or putting them in situations where they had no choice but to respond. "You know," David said, his voice getting slightly louder. "I've always wondered if you guys are allowed to defend yourselves if someone actually tried something. Like, what if someone grabbed your rifle? Would you break character then?" Lisa stepped closer to David, her voice urgent but quiet. "David, stop it." "You're making people stare." She was right. A small crowd was gathering, tourists pointing and whispering. Some seemed entertained by the show. Others looked concerned. A few were definitely recording everything on their phones, but David was in his element now. He fed off attention, especially when it came to demonstrating his knowledge of combat and self-defense. Back home, he was known for his ability to handle any situation, to stay calm under pressure and come out on top. "I bet your training is nothing compared to real martial arts," David said, moving even closer to the guard. "I mean, standing still is impressive, but can you actually fight? Have you ever been in a real combat situation?" The guard's breathing remained steady, his grip on his rifle unchanged, but David thought he saw something flicker in the man's eyes just for a split second. It might have been imagination, but it encouraged him to push further. "Lisa, watch this," David said, stepping back slightly. "I'm going to show you some basic martial arts forms. Maybe our friend here will appreciate real combat training." Before Lisa could stop him, David began performing a series of martial arts movements. They weren't aggressive or threatening, just basic forms that demonstrated his flexibility and control. But he made sure to do them right in front of the guard, close enough that his movements would be impossible to ignore. The crowd around them grew larger. Some tourists were clearly enjoying the entertainment, applauding David's moves and encouraging him to do more. Others looked uncomfortable, glancing around nervously as if expecting security guards to appear at any moment. "David, please stop," Lisa pleaded. "This is embarrassing." But David was feeling more confident with each passing moment. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't responded, hadn't even acknowledged his presence. To David, this felt like validation that the whole thing was just an act, a performance for tourists who didn't know any better. "You see that?" David said to the growing crowd. "Perfect focus. But I wonder..." He moved closer to the guard again, this time positioning himself directly in the soldier's line of sight. "I wonder if it's real focus or just really good acting." A few people in the crowd laughed, but Lisa wasn't amused. "David, I'm leaving. Meet me at the hotel when you're done making a fool of yourself." She turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd of onlookers. David watched her go with a pang of regret, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Too many people were watching, and his reputation was on the line. "Don't mind her," David said to the guard, as if they were old friends having a conversation. "She worries too much. But you understand, right? As a fellow warrior?" The guard's silence was starting to irritate David more than impress him. In martial arts, respect was earned through acknowledgement and response. Even opponents who were about to fight would bow to each other, recognizing each other's skills and dedication. This complete dismissal felt like disrespect, and David had never handled disrespect well. Back home, students who ignored him or acted like they were too good for his instruction quickly learned that attitude had consequences. "You know what I think?" David said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I think this whole thing is just for show. I think if someone really challenged you, really tested your limits, you'd break just like anyone else." Several people in the crowd made uncomfortable noises, sensing that David was crossing a line. A few started to drift away, no longer entertained by what was becoming an increasingly tense situation. But David was committed now. He had built his entire identity around being the toughest person in the room, the one who could handle any challenge. This guard's refusal to even acknowledge his presence felt like a challenge to everything David believed about himself. "I bet I could make you move," David said, stepping so close to the guard that they were almost touching. "I bet I could break that perfect composure of yours in about 10 seconds. The guard's face remained expressionless, but something in his posture seemed to shift slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but David caught it. His martial arts training had taught him to notice the smallest changes in an opponent's stance or breathing. "There it is," David said with satisfaction. "I knew you were human after all." The crowd was getting restless now, with more people pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a confrontation. Someone in the back called out for David to leave the guard alone, but he pretended not to hear. This was his moment to prove that all the stories about these guards were just tourist mythology. The crowd around David had grown to about 30 people, creating a semicircle of curious tourists with phones pointed in his direction. What had started as innocent sightseeing had transformed into an impromptu show, with David as the unwitting main performer. "Come on, man," someone called out from the crowd. "Just leave him alone." David turned toward the voice, a middle-aged man with an American accent who looked genuinely concerned. "It's okay," David said with a confident smile. "I'm not bothering anyone. Just having a conversation with a fellow professional. But the guard, Morrison, hadn't said a single word or shown any sign that he was even aware of David's presence. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the palace gates. His expression as blank as when David had first approached him nearly 15 minutes ago. The lack of response was eating away at David's confidence, though he tried not to show it. Back home in California, his martial arts students respected him because he could read people, understand their weaknesses, and respond appropriately. His success as an instructor came from his ability to connect with others and help them improve. This complete indifference was something entirely new for him. It was like trying to have a conversation with a brick wall, except brick walls didn't carry rifles and weren't supposed to be elite-trained soldiers. "You know what your problem is?" David said, stepping even closer to Morrison. He was now standing less than 2 feet away from the guard, close enough to see the individual threads in his red uniform and the slight moisture on his forehead from standing in the sun. "Your problem is that you've been standing here so long, you've forgotten how to be human. You've turned yourself into a decoration, a tourist attraction. That's not what real warriors do." A woman in the crowd, speaking with a British accent, called out sharply, "That's enough. Show some respect." David glanced at her briefly. She was probably in her 50s, wearing a floral dress and carrying a handbag, the kind of person who probably thought these guards were heroes just because they wore fancy uniforms. "I am showing respect," David replied. "I'm treating him like a professional, like someone who should be able to handle a simple conversation. If he can't even do that, then maybe he's not as elite as everyone thinks." The crowd was getting more restless now. Some people were clearly uncomfortable with how far David was pushing things, while others seemed to be enjoying the drama. A few had started taking videos, probably planning to post them on social media later. David knew he was past the point where he could just walk away and pretend nothing had happened. Too many people were watching. Too many phones were recording. If he backed down now, he would look weak, and the videos would make him look like someone who talked big but couldn't follow through. More importantly, his pride was fully engaged now. David had built his entire adult identity around being tough, confident, and unshakable. He was the guy who could handle any situation, the instructor who could command respect from anyone. This guard's refusal to even acknowledge his existence felt like a direct challenge to everything David believed about himself. "Fine," David said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "If you want to play statue, that's your choice. But don't expect me to be impressed by it." He began performing more elaborate martial arts movements, executing high kicks and spinning moves that required significant skill and flexibility. The crowd responded with scattered applause, and David felt his confidence returning. At least someone appreciated real talent, see that? David called out to Morrison while transitioning between forms. "That's what actual combat training looks like. Not standing around in a pretty uniform, but real martial arts that could actually be useful in a fight." Morrison's expression didn't change, but David was sure he saw the guard's jaw tighten slightly. It was progress, even if it was minimal. Encouraged by what he interpreted as a crack in the guard's composure, David decided to escalate his approach. He had always been good at reading people's pressure points, the specific things that would get under their skin and force a reaction. "I bet you've never even been in a real fight," David continued, moving through a series of defensive postures. "I bet all your training was just parade ground marching and standing at attention. When was the last time you actually had to defend yourself against someone who knew what they were doing?" A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The elderly British woman who had spoken earlier was shaking her head disapprovingly, and several tourists had stopped recording and were just watching with concerned expressions. But David was in full performance mode now. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his system, the same rush he got before tournament competitions. This was his element, the place where he felt most confident and in control. "You want to know what I think?" David said, completing a particularly impressive sequence of moves that drew appreciative murmurs from some onlookers. "I think you're scared to respond because you know you can't compete with real martial arts training." Morrison remained perfectly still, but David was convinced he could see subtle signs of irritation building beneath the surface. The guard's breathing seemed slightly more controlled than natural, as if he was consciously working to maintain his composure. "David, please stop this." The voice came from behind him, and David turned to see Lisa approaching through the crowd. She had obviously changed her mind about leaving him at the palace and had come back to try to talk sense into him. Lisa, perfect timing, David said with genuine enthusiasm. You have to see this. Watch how perfectly still he stays no matter what I do. It's actually pretty impressive even if it's not real combat training. It's time to go, Lisa said firmly, reaching for his arm. You've made your point. Everyone's watching and you're starting to attract the wrong kind of attention. She was right about the attention. David could see a police officer in the distance walking in their direction, probably alerted by the growing crowd and the commotion. But David felt like he was finally making progress with the guard. He had seen those subtle signs of tension, the slight tightening around Morrison's eyes that suggested his perfect composure wasn't as effortless as it appeared. Just give me one more minute, David said to Lisa. I think I'm getting through to him. Getting through to him? Lisa's voice rose in disbelief. David, look at yourself. You're harassing a man who's just trying to do his job. This isn't martial arts training, this is just bullying. The word bullying hit David like a slap across the face. He had never thought of himself as a bully. His martial arts philosophy was built around respect, discipline, and helping others improve. Bullies were the kind of people he had dedicated his life to standing up against. I'm not bullying anyone, David said defensively. I'm just trying to understand how someone can completely ignore everything around them. It's not natural. It's not healthy. Then let it go, Lisa pleaded. Let's go get lunch and see some other sights. We only have today to be tourists before your tournament starts. But David couldn't let it go. The challenge had been issued, even if only in his own mind. And everything he had been taught about martial arts told him that walking away from a challenge was the same as admitting defeat. One more test, David said, his voice taking on a harder edge, just to see how far this discipline really goes. Before Lisa could stop him, David reached out and tapped the barrel of Morrison's rifle with his finger. It was just a light touch, barely enough to move the weapon, but the symbolism was clear. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people backed away instinctively, sensing that David had just crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The police officer in the distance quickened his pace, speaking into his radio as he approached. David, what are you doing? Lisa grabbed his arm with both hands, trying to pull him away from the guard. But David was focused entirely on Morrison now, watching for any reaction to the physical contact. The guard's grip on his rifle remained steady, his expression unchanged, but David was sure he could see something different in his eyes. There, David said with satisfaction. I knew you were paying attention. No one can completely ignore being touched, especially when it involves their weapon. Morrison's lips moved slightly, so subtly that most of the crowd probably missed it, but David caught it, and he leaned in closer to hear what the guard might say. Step back, sir. The words were quiet but clear, spoken without moving Morrison's head or changing his facial expression. This is your only warning. David felt a surge of triumph. Finally, a response. After 15 minutes of one-sided conversation, he had managed to break through the guard's perfect composure and get an actual reaction. There we go, David said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. I knew you were human after all. So what happens if I don't step back? What happens if I decide to test your training a little further? The police officer was now pushing through the crowd, clearly intent on reaching David before the situation escalated any further. But David was too focused on his moment of victory to notice. Sir, I need you to move away from the guard immediately, the officer called out, still several people away from reaching David. But David had spent too long building up to this moment to back down now. He had proven that the guard's perfect discipline was breakable. The moment David's hand made contact with Morrison's rifle, everything changed. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but to David it felt like time had slowed down completely. His martial arts training had taught him to recognize the moment when a sparring session turned serious, when practice became real combat. This was that moment, except he had no idea it was coming. Morrison's response wasn't the theatrical reaction David had been expecting. There was no shouting, no dramatic movements, no warning signs that would have given David time to reconsider his actions. Instead, there was just swift, efficient, professional action. In one fluid motion, Morrison shifted his rifle to a safe position away from David's reach while simultaneously stepping forward. His left hand came up to control David's extended arm, while his right hand moved to David's shoulder. The technique was so smooth and practiced that it looked almost casual, like a dance move they had rehearsed together. David felt his balance disappear before he even understood what was happening. Morrison's movements weren't the flashy, dramatic techniques that David was used to seeing in martial arts competitions. There were no high kicks, no spinning moves, no elaborate throws. Just simple, effective leverage that used David's own momentum against him. "What the—" David started to say, but the words were cut short as he found himself airborne for a split second before crashing down onto the concrete courtyard. The landing knocked all the air out of his lungs with a sound that was clearly audible to the crowd of stunned tourists. David hit the ground hard, his right shoulder taking most of the impact as Morrison's technique guided his fall in a way that prevented serious injury while still being completely effective. Pain shot through David's shoulder and down his arm as he rolled onto his back, gasping for breath. The confident martial artist who had been performing impressive kicks and demonstrating his superior training just moments before was now lying on the ground, trying to figure out what had just happened to him. Morrison had already returned to his original position, rifle held at the proper angle, expression back to its previous blank state. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the brief exchange, it would appear that nothing had happened at all. The guard looked exactly the same as he had 10 minutes earlier, perfectly composed and motionless. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Phones that had been recording David's martial arts demonstration were now capturing his humiliating defeat, preserving every moment of his confusion and pain for potential viral fame. "Oh my God, David." Lisa rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. "Are you okay? Can you move?" David tried to sit up, but the movement sent another wave of pain through his shoulder. His right arm wasn't responding properly, and he was pretty sure something was either dislocated or badly strained. The physical pain was intense, but the emotional shock was even worse. What did he— David struggled to form complete sentences, his mind still trying to process what had just occurred. One moment he had been in complete control of the situation, demonstrating his superior martial arts skills to an appreciative crowd. The next moment he was flat on his back, defeated by a man who had barely seemed to move. "Sir, please remain still while we assess your condition." The police officer who had been approaching during David's confrontation with Morrison was now kneeling beside him, speaking into his radio while checking David for obvious injuries. "I need medical assistance at the palace gates," the officer spoke into his radio. "One individual down with possible shoulder injury. Also requesting backup for a potential assault on Royal Guard." The words "assault on Royal Guard" hit David like another physical blow. In his mind, he had been engaging in a friendly test of skills, a martial arts challenge between professionals. The idea that his actions could be interpreted as a criminal assault had never occurred to him. "Assault?" David managed to say, his voice weak and confused. "I wasn't assaulting anyone. I was just testing his training." The police officer gave him a look that contained no sympathy whatsoever. "Sir, you made physical contact with a Queen's Guard and attempted to grab his weapon. That constitutes assault regardless of your intentions." More police officers were arriving now, having been radioed by their colleague. The crowd of tourists was being moved back to create a larger perimeter around the scene, though many were still recording everything on their phones from a distance. David could hear fragments of conversations from the crowd as he lay on the concrete, each comment adding to his growing sense of humiliation and disbelief. "Did you see how fast that happened? The guard barely moved and the guy just went flying. What an idiot. What did he think was going to happen? Someone should have stopped him before it got to this point." Lisa was holding his left hand, tears starting to form in her eyes. "David, what were you thinking? Why didn't you just walk away when I asked you to?" David didn't have an answer for her. The confident martial artist who had approached Morrison with complete certainty about his own abilities was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand just how badly he had miscalculated the entire situation. "I thought—" David started, then stopped. What had he thought? That he was testing another martial artist? That he could impress the crowd with his superior skills? That the guard's discipline was just an act that could be broken with enough pressure? Looking back at Morrison, who stood exactly as he had before their brief encounter, David began to realize how completely wrong he had been about everything. The guard's stillness wasn't an act or a performance. It was the external manifestation of genuine professional training that was far beyond anything David had ever encountered. A paramedic team arrived and began checking David's injuries more thoroughly. His shoulder was definitely dislocated, though fortunately there didn't appear to be any broken bones. They worked efficiently to stabilize his arm and prepare him for transport to a hospital. "This is going to hurt," one of the paramedics warned before beginning to manipulate David's shoulder back into position. The pain was immediate and intense, causing David to cry out involuntarily. But even as the physical agony shot through his body, it was nothing compared to the mental anguish of understanding how completely he had humiliated himself. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault on a member of the Royal Guard," one of the police officers announced formally. "You have the right to remain silent." As the officer continued reading David his rights, the full scope of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a martial arts lesson gone wrong or an embarrassing tourist moment. This was a criminal matter that could have serious consequences for his future. The tournament he had come to London to compete in would have to proceed without him. His reputation as a martial arts instructor would be permanently damaged. His relationship with Lisa might not survive the embarrassment and legal troubles he had created for both of them, but perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that everything he had believed about his own abilities and judgment had been proven completely wrong in the span of 3 seconds. The paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital. David caught one last glimpse of Morrison. The guard remained at his post, expression unchanged, seemingly unaffected by the entire incident. To him, it had probably been just another routine part of his duties. Barely worth remembering for David, it would be the moment that changed everything about how he understood himself and his place in the world. The crowd of tourists was already beginning to disperse, their momentary entertainment over. But David knew that their phone recordings would live on, probably appearing on social media within hours. His moment of supreme confidence had been captured for the world to see, along with its immediate and devastating consequences. "Why didn't you listen to me?" Lisa asked quietly as they loaded David into the ambulance. "I tried to warn you. I tried to get you to stop." David wanted to answer her, wanted to explain his thinking or defend his actions, but there was no explanation that would make sense. No defense that wouldn't sound like empty excuses. He had been completely outclassed by someone he had underestimated, and the proof was lying right there on the concrete for everyone to see. The martial artist who had been so confident in his superior training and abilities had been defeated by a man who barely seemed to exert any effort at all. As the ambulance pulled away from Buckingham Palace, David closed his eyes and tried to process the reality of what had just happened to him. The physical pain in his shoulder was already beginning to fade thanks to the medication the paramedics had given him. The damage to his pride and reputation would take much longer to heal. The emergency room at St. Thomas's Hospital was busier than David had expected for a Tuesday afternoon. He sat on an examination table, his right arm in a sling, waiting for the doctor to return with his discharge papers. The pain medication had made his shoulder feel better, but nothing could ease the growing dread he felt about everything else that was waiting for him outside the hospital. Lisa sat in a plastic chair beside the examination table, scrolling through her phone with an expression that David had never seen before. It wasn't anger exactly or disappointment. It was something worse, a kind of distant sadness that suggested she was already beginning to disconnect from him emotionally. "How bad is it?" David asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lisa held up her phone so he could see the screen. There were already 3 different videos of his confrontation with Morrison circulating on social media, each with thousands of views and hundreds of comments. The titles were variations of "Arrogant Martial Artist Gets," "Destroyed by Royal Guard," and "Tourist Learns Hard Lesson at Buckingham Palace." The longest video has been viewed 50,000 times in the last 2 hours, Lisa said quietly. "And it's spreading fast. Someone already identified you by name and found your martial arts school's website." David felt sick to his stomach as he read some of the comments beneath the videos. Most of them were mocking his overconfidence and celebrating his downfall. A few expressed sympathy for Lisa, having to deal with such an embarrassing boyfriend. None of them took his side or suggested that his actions had been reasonable. "My students are going to see this," David said, the reality of his situation hitting him with fresh force. "My parents, my instructors, everyone back home." "Yes, they probably will," Lisa agreed. "The question is what you're going to say to them when they ask what you were thinking." Before David could answer, The doctor returned with a clipboard full of paperwork. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who had probably seen his share of tourist-related injuries over the years. Good news is that your shoulder dislocation was clean and straightforward, the doctor explained. No fractures, no torn ligaments that we can detect. You should be able to remove the sling in a few days, though I'd recommend avoiding any strenuous physical activity for at least 2 weeks. What about martial arts training? David asked. I'm supposed to compete in a tournament this weekend. The doctor gave him a look that suggested he already knew the story behind David's injury. I'm afraid that's completely out of the question. Any kind of combat activity could re-injure your shoulder much more seriously. You'll need to take time to heal properly. David nodded, though the tournament was now the least of his concerns. As he signed the discharge papers, he could hear his phone buzzing repeatedly with notifications from social media, text messages, and missed calls. Mr. Chen, a new voice said from the examination room doorway. David looked up to see 2 police officers, a man and a woman, both wearing serious expressions. We need you to come with us to the station to complete your processing. The reality of criminal charges had somehow been pushed to the back of David's mind while he dealt with his injury and the social media humiliation. Now it came rushing back with full force. Processing? David asked weakly. You've been charged with assault on a member of the Royal Guard, the female officer explained. This is a serious offense that requires formal booking and an appearance before a magistrate. You'll need to surrender your passport until the matter is resolved. Lisa stood up and gathered her purse, her movements mechanical and distant. I'll follow you to the station, she told David, though her tone suggested it was more out of obligation than desire. The ride to the police station gave David time to think about how drastically his life had changed in the span of a few hours. This morning he had been a confident martial arts instructor, looking forward to competing in his first European tournament. Now he was injured, facing criminal charges and dealing with viral internet fame for all the wrong reasons. At the station, the booking process was both humiliating and eye-opening. Having his fingerprints taken and his photograph captured for a criminal record made the consequences of his actions feel more real and permanent than anything else had so far. You'll be released on your own. Recognizance, the processing officer explained. But you cannot leave the United Kingdom until your court date. That's scheduled for next Monday at 10 a.m. Next Monday? David's voice cracked slightly. But our flight home is Thursday. I have students expecting me back at the school on Friday. I'm afraid that's no longer possible, the officer replied matter-of-factly. Assault on a royal guard is taken very seriously here. The magistrate will need to hear your case before any travel restrictions can be lifted. When David was finally released from the police station, it was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. Lisa was waiting for him in the lobby, looking exhausted and emotionally drained. We need to find a lawyer, she said without any greeting or small talk. And we need to call the airline to change our tickets. And you need to call your students to let them know you won't be back this week. They walked back to their hotel in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about how to handle the mess David had created. The streets of London, which had seemed so exciting and full of possibility that morning, now felt foreign and unwelcoming. Back in their hotel room, David finally worked up the courage to check his phone properly. There were 47 missed calls, dozens of text messages, and hundreds of social media notifications. His martial arts school's Facebook page was flooded with comments about the videos, ranging from supportive messages from loyal students to harsh criticism from competitors and strangers. The worst message was from his sensei, the man who had taught David everything he knew about martial arts and who had always emphasized the importance of discipline, respect, and humility. David, I've seen the videos. We need to talk when you get back. What you did goes against everything we've tried to teach you about the martial arts way. I'm very disappointed. David set his phone aside and sat on the edge of the hotel bed, finally allowing himself to fully process what had happened. The confident martial artist who had woken up that morning was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand just how much he had misunderstood about strength, discipline, and respect. I thought I was testing him, David said quietly, speaking more to himself than to Lisa. I thought I was showing respect for real training by challenging it. Lisa looked up from her laptop, where she had been researching British criminal law, and trying to find recommendations for lawyers who specialized in tourist-related legal problems. You weren't testing him. David, you were harassing him. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see it is part of the problem. Her words stung because they were true. Looking back at his actions with the clarity that comes after consequences, David could see that his behavior had been exactly what she described. He had created a one-sided confrontation with someone who was just trying to do his job professionally. "Morrison," David said suddenly, remembering the guard's name tag. "What about him?" "He warned me. He told me to step back and I ignored him. I thought it meant I was winning some kind of challenge, but he was actually trying to help me avoid exactly what happened." Lisa closed her laptop and looked at David directly for the first time since they had left the hospital. "So what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you going to learn something from this, or are you going to spend the rest of your life making excuses and blaming everyone else for what happened?" David considered her question seriously. The easy path would be to claim that Morrison had overreacted, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that he had been treated unfairly. His pride wanted him to find a way to spin the story that preserved his reputation and made him look like the victim. But the videos didn't lie. His own words and actions were recorded clearly for anyone to see. There was no editing or manipulation that could make his behavior look reasonable or justified. "I need to apologize," David said finally. "To Morrison, to everyone who saw the videos, to my students. I need to admit that I was completely wrong about everything." Lisa's expression softened slightly, the first sign of warmth she had shown him since the incident. "That's a start. But apologizing is the easy part. The hard part is actually changing the attitudes and behaviors that led to this situation." Over the next few days, as David dealt with lawyers and court appearances and the practical aspects of his legal troubles, he had plenty of time to think about Lisa's words. The magistrate had been surprisingly understanding, giving him a suspended sentence and a substantial fine rather than jail time, partly because Morrison himself had testified that David's actions seemed to come from misguided enthusiasm rather than malicious intent. But the legal resolution was only one small part of David's problems. The viral videos had been picked up by major news outlets as a humorous human interest story. His martial arts school was receiving calls from reporters wanting to interview him about his showdown with the royal guard. Most painful of all were the conversations with his students when he finally returned home the following week. The young people who had looked up to him as a role model